Such a beautiful song. Thank you very much. I just enjoyed both those special musics a great deal. And if you were paying careful attention, you would have seen the theme that united them. They both referred to being a child of God, didn't they? A child of God, that as we know that God would never forget his children. And being a child of God, you are constantly in his care. And of course, that will cast out fear. You know, in this day and age of the pandemic and of the cold and all the things we face, the social strife, it's normal to be afraid. And even Christians feel fear, but the difference for Christians is that we are not slaves of our fear, right? The words of that song are so true and so powerful. Do Christians have anxiety, fear, depression at times? Yes, they do, but they're not controlled by those things, right? They have a faith that rises above those things. And that song, both those songs express that so well, and I want to thank you for them and for the beauty with which they were performed. So, greetings to you this morning from Andrews University, from the seminary, and from Berrien Springs, where there's a heat wave in effect, and it's currently 20 degrees. That's after a week, I think, of going no higher than about 10 degrees, and with the wind chill often into the negative numbers. So we're happy to be in person here, giving you our greetings. And I say we because my son has joined me, Patrick, over in the pew here. You can wave at the assembled crowd. And next to Patrick are Jennifer and Michael Schwerzer, who I want to thank for their hospitality. Patrick and I have been on a writing retreat at Daytona Beach for the last month. Patrick is working on a biography of an Adventist lady who is 93, but when she was a teenager was a member of the Hitler Youth. And he's writing her story of becoming a Christian Adventist, moving from following Hitler to following Jesus Christ. And it's an amazing story. Is it possible to be an Adventist Nazi at times? Hers is a long story that only begins with her becoming an Adventist, and then the road to finding out what the true character of God is like is truly a profound one. So we've spent the last few weeks there. I've been editing a book, and we're flying out back north tomorrow, as long as the planes still work in the weather they've got up there. And the Schwerzers are putting us up in our trailer for a couple of nights, and we are appreciative of that, and it gives us the opportunity to be with you. Jeff Brom, the attorney who attends here, called me up and asked if he thought I'd have to come by Zoom. And I said, well, I may be in your neck of the woods. So here we are today, and I am going to share with you the fruit of some experiences that I've had over the last few years in gaining a deeper insight into the Adventist prophetic heritage. I was raised an Adventist, became familiar with its teachings as a teenager, but there are depths to our prophetic heritage that I have only come to understand more recently. And I'm going to try, I was using the slides as notes, and I used this during the main sermon, but I'm going to try perhaps just to use the one up here because I'll forward one and forget I haven't forwarded the other one. And so we'll try this. The sanctuary, the Sabbath, and social reform. This afternoon, I'm going to talk more directly about issues of religious freedom and church and state in this country. But I wanted this morning to talk about our Adventist prophetic background in understanding prophecy and the gospel and how that caused us to relate to social events around us, not just religious freedom, but a range of issues that unfortunately we lost sight of in much of the 20th century. And as a historian, I'm wanting to help us recover as a church and as a community. So I'm going to be talking about a couple of trips that I've taken in the recent past. Here I am spending a month in Florida. I'm a senior enough professor at Andrews that I managed to get my research semester in the winter. And I can do research from anywhere, and so I choose to do it somewhere warmer than Andrews University. And the last 2 years, I've traveled to Puerto Rico. We have a university there, Antillean College, and I teach them a Bible course, and they give me a place to stay, and then I spend the rest of my time reading and writing and occasionally surfing, because that's something I like to do. And this year, they were closed down because of the pandemic. So Florida is my backup location. And the water's a little colder here, and the surf isn't quite as good, but it's better than Berrien Springs. And I've enjoyed the time that I've had here with my son. But in my time in Puerto Rico, I gained some insights into how the Sabbath message is being used by other Christians to help people in practical ways in their communities. Not by Seventh-day Adventists, but by other Christians who are taking the biblical Sabbath teachings and applying them to the problems, social and economic and justice problems in the world and in Puerto Rico. And it's something we should know about as Adventists. And also, I got a graduate degree in history from Notre Dame, and while I was there, I gained some insights into the sanctuary that also helped me on this trip of learning about social justice from our pioneers and Adventist prophecy, and then finally about seeing Christ more clearly in the church today. So let me begin by talking about my trip to Puerto Rico last year. It was during the time we were studying the book of Daniel. And it's the first time that I had gone to a center, spent significant time at a center of American empire, right? Did you know America had an empire? We mostly have a trading empire, but it was the Spanish-American War that brought several nations, including the Philippines and Cuba and Puerto Rico, under the direct jurisdiction of the United States. And it was there that I came across a critique of empire in the Bible most directly. And it came about from studying Daniel chapter 5. This was almost 1 year ago, because I remember they were talking about the coronavirus breaking out, and there might have to be quarantine soon. And we were studying Daniel chapter 5, which you remember is the story of Belshazzar's feast, right? Where they're eating and drinking with the sacred cups and vessels from the temple of God, and they drank wine, and they praised the gods of gold and of silver, of brass, of iron, of wood, and of stone. And for the first time, I've told this, preached this, taught this chapter many times, quite familiar with it, but I'd never really focused on this phrase at the end about the gods of gold and silver, brass, iron, wood, and stone. It seemed like such a specific list of items, and I was wondering, does this have some significance? Why didn't they just talk about the gods of gold and silver? Or why is there this listing of items in this way? And so you easily do a quick search with your electronic Bible. And I discovered that this precise list is found at least 2 other places in the Old Testament. It's there in Chronicles and Isaiah. You can find it fairly easily. But in that instance, their lists of items used to build God's temple in Jerusalem. So think about this for a moment. There's a little bit of a contrast being made, isn't there? That these items that were good, that God made them, and God wanted them to be used in His temple to worship God, those items had been taken by the Babylonians, and instead of using them to worship God, they used them as gods themselves, right? And they worshiped the things that they made with their hands, and they became a barbarous, brutal nation that God brought justice upon on that night through the Medes and the Persians, right? This was the end of their empire, and it was because of their turning from the true God, which Nebuchadnezzar had known about and worshipped, right? We know that. But they focused on the glorification of their kingdom through these material means and engaged in immorality, which is recorded in the prophets, mistreatment of the peoples around them. And God brought justice and judgment on the nation that night. Now, there's another place in the Bible where these elements are listed, not just these 6 items, but part of a larger list, And that's in Revelation 18, which is a chapter about the fall of symbolic Babylon. So you can see it's directly connected, right? The literal Babylon falls in the time of Daniel, and John uses that to describe the fall of Babylon at the time of the end. Now, you're familiar with the three angels' messages of Revelation 14. Well, this is the fourth angel, right? And we've taught that it's kind of an intensification of those first three messages. And this is really talking about the ultimate and final and full fall of Babylon. You mighty city, in a single hour your judgment has come. And the merchants of the earth weep and mourn for their cargo, for their trade. And then there's a whole list of items given. But among that list, you will find, in the same order as is found in Daniel 5, gold, silver, scented wood, bronze, iron, and marble. The same 6 items that we'd previously seen. And so clearly there's an implication that these merchants, the problem with these merchants of the earth, which have colluded with the dragon and the beast, and it's a combination of civil and religious power, that has acted not just in a militaristic way, but in a commercial way. Right? This is a description of buying and selling. But again, like the Old Testament, it's not that buying and selling are wrong in themselves. It's that when buying and selling becomes the central feature and becomes almost an act of worship in itself, and this is shown. Do I have a little red light? No, I don't seem to have a little red light. That the bottom, where it says oil, fine flour, wheat, cattle, and sheep, horses, and chariots, and slaves, or the souls of men, or that is the souls of men. So we can see immediately that what's being brought under judgment here and critiqued here isn't just the act of buying and selling these things, which we can see in the Old Testament is okay as long as God is still God, but it is when this exploitive trading, you might call it exploitive capitalism, is carried out at the expense of human beings. And we talked about the songs that were sung earlier about the child of God, that we each are, and it's a short step from there to talking about the children of God, that we all are, right? And this is a central teaching of Christianity. We are all made in the image of God. We are all children of God. And when you engage in slavery, you are saying or doing or showing by your actions that you believe some are less children of God than others, right? Based on the color of their skin, their class, their racial or ethnic background. And here in Revelation, then, we have this whole system. And if we think about the timing of this and when this is happening, this is at the end of Western civilization. And the nations of the West, for 400 plus years, engaged in this kind of commerce that was built on the exploitation of slaves and slave labor. All of the nations of the West, without any meaningful exception that I can think of. It's been 150 years, some might say, since that happened. But we are still coming to terms with the role of Christians in this event, right? Revelation 18 is about a false Christianity. And more recently, I've become aware that, yes, some Christians were opposed to slavery, but unfortunately there were many other Christians, especially those that were part of the churches of Christendom, those churches that were combined with the state, like the Anglican Church and the Lutheran Church and the Catholic Church. They formally supported the slave trade. And there's a rather scary book that I've read recently, Christian Slavery, which makes quite compellingly the argument that it was actually Protestant Christian leaders that created the notion of white superiority based on the need to justify slavery in the face of missions and the conversion of African slaves. You see, what happened at the beginning, the Portuguese and the Catholics started the slave trade from Africa. Part of the justification was they're not Christians, therefore you can enslave them. Non-Christian peoples you can enslave. Unfortunately, many Protestant nations, including England, which is my heritage, I was born there, though mostly Irish, which will become important later on, is very, very involved in the slave trade. And again, you could justify it because they weren't Christian. The problem was Christian leaders and missionaries said, no, we have an obligation to give the gospel to everyone, so we need to give it to our slaves. And so in the Caribbean, there began to be a change in the laws of slavery that rather than justifying slavery by saying you have white Christian servants and black slaves, pagan slaves, now we're going to allow conversion to Christianity by the slaves, but we're going to continue to enslave them, not based on their religious belief, but based on their color. And you can literally see the laws being changed in these countries to no longer reflect a religious distinction, but now reflecting a racial distinction. And so the beginnings of a sense of white supremacy or superiority lie in the hands, unfortunately, of certain Protestant leaders who were trying to do a good thing in one sense by allowing the gospel to be preached to slaves, but did a bad thing in another sense by creating a racial hierarchy in the West, which really didn't exist prior to that time. Now, our early Adventist pioneers were more aware of this story than we are today. They believed that their prophetic message spoke against this mistreatment and abuse of the gospel in calling one class of people lesser than another class. This came something of a surprise to me because I had grown up knowing about the three angels' messages. But it wasn't until about 12 years ago that I really began looking at our prophetic message in its social context, and this was triggered by my experience at Notre Dame, studying a graduate degree in history. And as part of my duties there, I was a graduate assistant to a professor who taught a class on American religious history. And he asked me to come in and give a lecture on the history of Adventism. And so I thought, well, this is going to be unique and interesting. I know the story and the background and have taught it before, usually to Adventist audiences. And here I was going to teach it to a group of Catholic young people. And as I was going through it, how am I going to make it? It's not like I was trying to convert them to Adventism, but I was trying to explain the history and rise of Adventism in a way they could understand and appreciate, and not just immediately say, well, that's a fanciful story. And as you begin talking about the Great Disappointment in 1844, and then, but no, it's the cleansing of the heavenly sanctuary, it seemed like what some have described as kind of a face-saving device for not wanting just to admit that your prophetic date was wrong. And so I said, how else can I explain this story? Not that I don't believe that. I think the biblical basis is very solid. But there's got to be more to it than just something changing in heaven. And I had been studying the history of American religions, of course, in my program, and I came across a fact that really intrigued me, that in 1844, the year that we talk about the cleansing of the heavenly sanctuary, that the two biggest Christian churches in America split in half over the issue of slavery. And that many historians, secular historians, view that event as being the beginning of the pathway to the inevitability of the Civil War. Because if the two biggest churches in America, the two biggest moral communities, could not resolve the issue of slavery and stay together, then neither could the country, and it would inevitably need to be solved by force of arms. And this is indeed what happened. And it's interesting also that as I read both Ellen White and Abraham Lincoln, they viewed the Civil War as part of the refining and judging and chastening and cleansing process that God was bringing to America and Christianity to purge and remove from it the sins of slavery. Now, if that process began in 1844, why can't we see that as part of, as not the whole story, but as part of the story of God cleansing the Christian church in America from its sins? And indeed, it caused me to go back and look more closely at what our pioneers had written. They believed that the cleansing of the heavenly sanctuary wasn't just about something in heaven, and you're probably familiar with at least part of it, that it had to do with this cleansing of the soul temple, right? As Christ puts away the sins of the faithful in heaven, so there should be a putting away of sins in our individual lives. But often we make it purely individual, so we need to become better people, whereas our pioneers viewed it as community-based, that there would be a cleansing in heaven, a cleansing of you individually, but also a cleansing of our community as a people. And it's seen clearly here in great controversy. While the investigative judgment is going forward in heaven, while the sins of penitent believers are being removed from the sanctuary, there is to be a special work of purification, of putting away of sin among God's people upon earth. You may have heard that before, but have you considered that the focus isn't just individual, but it's about a church, it's about a community. Then the church, which our Lord at his coming is to receive to himself, will be a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing. That this Civil War period, this ending of slavery, of injustice, was one of the things that God was beginning to do with the cleansing of the sanctuary. And she spoke about this, the need for there to be cleansing. There are a few in the ranks of Sabbath keepers who sympathize with the slaveholder. When they embraced the truth, they did not leave behind them all the errors they should have left. They need a more thorough draught from the cleansing fountain of truth. Some have brought along with them their old political prejudices, which are not in harmony with the principles of truth. Did you know that the cleansing of the sanctuary and of the gospel might be related to beliefs that we hold that might be considered political or social beliefs that undermine the image of God in other people? Ellen White said that we need to be cleansed of those things. Adventist historian Kevin Burton, he's getting his PhD here in Florida, actually, but he's now at Southern and will be moving up to Andrews to be center of the Adventist research facility there. And he's uncovered a wealth of connections between the abolitionist movement and the Millerite movement, the early Adventists. They would share the same office spaces, the same printers, preach in the same halls, at the same meetings. So you would hear a presentation about abolitionism and freeing slaves, and then you would hear about Christ's coming in 1844. And this was the same audience, the same group of people. There was a tremendous overlap between these two groups. Ellen White, I shared the statement with you already about the need for cleansing, and she went so far as to say those that will not be cleansed of these racist and pro-slavery ideas should actually not be part of the church. The church, this was in a test of fellowship for her. The three angels' messages all had a social dimension to them. I had understood the spiritual teaching of these messages, but when the first angel declared that the hour of God's judgment had come, early Adventists believed that America was doubly under judgment because of its failure to see the image of God in all peoples, especially in blacks and slaves. Right? This message to all nations, kindred, tongue, and people, how can it be taken seriously if it does not object to the mistreatment of a whole class of people? The second message, come out of Babylon. I'd understood coming out of Babylon had to do with Sabbath, right? And not accepting the full 10 Commandments. Well, it did for Adventists, but it also, for a larger group that I actually read about in history books, there was a come-outer movement coming out of Babylon, which were the churches that refused to condemn slavery. And it was these 2 points that caused our Adventist members to leave many churches of the day. And finally, the mark of the beast was given, the third angel's message, by a beast whose speaking as a dragon was seen in its support of slavery, racism, and imperialism. And let's talk about that dragon for a moment, because that was the scripture reading for today. And you may be familiar with Revelation 13, the lamb-like beast, the beast with lamb-like horns that speaks as a dragon. And the lamb-like aspects of it, the peace, the freedom, Christ-like features, we have focused on the religious freedom aspect. But there's 2 horns, aren't there? And if you read the Great Controversy and you study the meaning of these horns in the Bible, there's a very persuasive case to be made that it represents Protestantism or freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, and republicanism. Republicanism being a government of the people, by the people, for the people, the rule of law, basic questions of justice and equality in society. We've long understood that first horn, but our pioneers understood both horns as being important. And the second element that I hadn't understood as a teenager was I had been told that America would speak as a dragon in the future, right? That right now we stood for freedom and justice, but at some point in the future when we started persecuting Adventists for Sabbath, that would be speaking as a dragon. Well, that's not what our pioneers believed. They believed that America was speaking as a dragon then, right? Both these things existed at the same time. We had these high ideals, the Declaration of Independence, all men created equal, but then we had slavery, and we had racism, and we had these problems, and we weren't dealing with them adequately. And it was a message that they would write about in the church papers of the day, the Review and Herald, articles condemning the leadership of America for supporting slavery, a long poem by Uriah Smith talking about Revelation 13, the dragon-like features as being in slavery and racism. And as I thought about this, it amazed me that they would speak so openly about an issue. Was slavery ever a political issue in the United States? Right? Were there political differences over slavery? In fact, it's probably the most divisive political issue in the history of our country. Right? It is the thing that caused the Civil War. But did that cause Adventists to not speak about it? They spoke about it in the pages of their papers because they believed it was so critically a moral issue of the gospel, the image of God in humanity, that whether or not it was political, they had to speak to it. And they did. Ellen White wrote this, they maintained the slave is the property of the master and should not be taken from him. I was shown that it mattered not how much the master had paid for human flesh and the souls of men. God gives him no title to human souls, and he has no right to hold them as his property. Christ died for the whole human family, whether white or black. Mattered not, right? We have this phrase, black lives matter, white lives matter, all lives matter. Well, she says that these lives matter in her day. And she believed in protest. Of course, growing up as a kid, a non-political, good middle-class Adventist kid, the thought of marching and protests on the streets and sounded like getting down and dirty and not something that I would want to sully my hands with. But then I became familiar with our pioneers. And protest march in the street, a peaceful protest march, is actually a constitutionally protected right. Did you know that? Like the First Amendment protects the right of the people to gather together to peacefully seek for a redress of their grievances. Arson and looting, that's a separate matter. That's not protected and shouldn't be. But that's not a very radical form of protest. You call the police station, you get a police escort, you walk to City Hall, give a few speeches, and go home. What's a more radical form of protest? Have you heard of civil disobedience? Actually breaking laws to go against the government, right? Adventists would never do that. We're into law and order. We keep the commandments and obey the government. But you know, our pioneers did. They believed in this form of protest if it was needed. In fact, Ellen White said we had a duty to break the federal law regarding the Fugitive Slave Act. There was a law passed saying escaped slaves had to be returned to their masters, and you could be fined or spend time in jail for breaking that. And she said, this law of our land requiring us to deliver a slave to his master, we are not to obey. Right? A ringleader of civil disobedience. Founder of your church, one of the founders, was a ringleader of civil disobedience. Several Adventist leaders participated in the Underground Railway. John Byington, our first General Conference president. If you haven't seen the movie Harriet Tubman, go and rent it and watch it. An almost Ellen White-like figure who had visions and who was deeply Christian and led many, many slaves to freedom. She undoubtedly had contact with Adventists. And we know that Sojourner Truth, another African-American leader, did have close contacts with Adventists and may have been baptized in Adventist herself. So in our early Adventist ranks, we had these radical social progressives that would curl most of our middle-class hair today. So what about after slavery was over? Everything was okay, and Ellen White wouldn't say anything further, would she? Well, not true. She realized the end of a legal system doesn't solve all the problems that legal injustice brought with it. And she talked about the debt that America owed, a debt of love to the colored race, and that God has ordained that they should make restitution for the wrong they have done them in the past. You know what restitution is? Being paid back for. When you take something from someone unfairly, we have another word for it today. Do you know what that word is? It's reparation. It's a synonym for reparation, right? It seems so radical and controversial, and yet our founding prophet called for it. And often you'll hear, well, I didn't keep slaves. None of my ancestors kept slaves. In fact, you remember I said I was from Ireland? That would allow me to play that card. The Irish were not slaveholders, one of the few nations. We were basically kept in bondage by the British. But she doesn't let me off the hook, because she says this: those who have taken no active part in enforcing slavery upon the colored people are not relieved from the responsibility of making special efforts to remove, as far as possible, the sure result of their enslavement. So I didn't have slaves, and neither did my ancestors, but as a white man, I have benefited from the system and structure that has been built up through the use of that kind of activity and labor. And while I'm not responsible for what happened in the past, I do become responsible for my failing to act or choosing to act in appropriate ways to that legacy today. Now, of course, most of us think that American slavery ended with a civil war, and technically it's true, but it was replaced with a combination of Jim Crow discrimination laws and something called sharecropping indebtedness. Sharecropping was initially promised that the freed slaves would get 40 acres and a mule. If you want to spend a productive few minutes on the internet and Google, look up 40 acres, mule, freed slaves, and you'll find that promises were made, and you will also discover that this 40 acres and the mule never came to pass. The story of the consideration of reparations for slaves is rather a long and sad one. Bills were in Congress a few times, and it was never followed through on. What happened instead, freed slaves returned in many instances to the plantations that they worked at, and they were given loans to purchase the land, and loans to buy the seed, and loans to buy the tools, and soon they were indebted to their old masters, and they had to pay off part of those loans every year, and more often than not, they just continued in debt over time, and rather than being real slaves, they were now wage slaves, effectively. And in some instances, that has spread to the rest of American society, where many of us work for corporate America and our credit card payments from one paycheck to the next, never quite getting ahead of this wage slavery. But here it was much more severe, and little opportunity for progress was made. And there's a whole sad and sorry story of the 20th century and race relations, which is the topic of another lecture, because today I want to go back to Puerto Rico and my experiences there, and how the Sabbath message, so I've shared with you the sanctuary, and now I want to show how the Sabbath should enable us to respond today to this inequity in more powerful ways than we have thought of previously. So, based on that second horn, right? The first horn is Protestantism and religious freedom. And what's the second horn? Just a quick quiz. It's republicanism, democracy, the rule of law. And based on our concern for the second horn, our Adventist founders critiqued the Spanish-American War. They said that this war was driven by anti-Catholicism and in part racism, because it was against the Filipinos, a non-white community, against the Spanish, a Catholic community, and they criticized it as a race war, particularly a war of Anglo-Saxons against the colored race in Liberty magazine. They used their apocalyptic view of Revelation 13 to hold our government to the highest standards of human rights. And of course, it was this war that brought Puerto Rico under the oversight of the United States government. And my experience in Puerto Rico in light of this has been truly illuminating. There's a book that, if you're interested in this aspect of American history or Puerto Rico, that's worth reading, Fantasy Island. There never was slavery by Americans in Puerto Rico. We got it after slavery was over. And the people in Puerto Rico, did you know that they're U.S. citizens, right? They have the right to come here. And so you think, as U.S. citizens, this is a U.S. territory, we would be treating them as part of our own, the fruits of our civilization. But what happened is kind of a sad story of government inaction and predatory corporate engagement, investment in the island, collaboration with the elites, a lot of municipal bonds going in at high interest rates, difficulty to pay them back, money invested by private banks. It results in $75 billion of bond debt and $40 billion in unfunded pension liability. And that was before the hurricane and earthquakes that recently happened. And Puerto Rico is drowning in a sea of American investment bank debt. And the practical experience of that is this. You go to Puerto Rico and you go to the shopping centers, and they are beautiful and modern and new. And you could be in Florida or Michigan. And as long as you're kind of in the corporate commercial sphere, it's a first world country. But when you go out onto the city streets, away from the corporate area and into the homes of the people, or even the public infrastructure, you find a very different story, right? You find a developing nation is the feel of it. And it spills over from the physical infrastructure to also healthcare and education. There's half as many doctors fulfilling the needs there as there are for the U.S. citizen. Patients can wait as long as 13 hours to be seen in an emergency room. In the U.S., it's 30 to 60 minutes. Also, the educational system is very underfunded and poor. 95% of public school students in Puerto Rico graduate at a sub-basic level. 60% do not even graduate. So it's a country that struggles with its education and health infrastructure. And to think that we would allow American citizens to live in ways that we usually associate with third world and developing and other countries is a disappointment. Now, Adventists have been in Puerto Rico for many decades. We have medical work there and we have educational work there. But really, we can only make a small dent into this really big problem. We have one hospital, Bella Vista Hospital, quite near the university that's there, and we have a university, but just one. And there's a few primary and secondary schools scattered about. But it's an enormous problem that's really a systemic problem, that having a hospital and a college is like putting a Band-Aid on a gaping wound. Is there nothing else that Adventists have to offer to try to deal with the structural and systemic problems that have been caused by a combination of American corporate greed and political carelessness and lack of interest? Or are we just left trying to pick up the pieces from the floor with our few medical and educational resources? And so I was really interested to find that there were some Christians who took seriously the biblical teachings on the Sabbath. But, surprise, it wasn't Seventh-day Adventists. Actually, Ellen White has these insights. We should be awake to this. If you read Patriarchs and Prophets, chapter 50, she talks about the Sabbath years, right? Every 7 years, the land was to rest, debts were forgiven, slaves were freed. Every 7 sevens would be a year of Jubilee. All these things would happen, plus land would be restored to the people that had lost it earlier on. And so there would be a resetting of economic and social equality at some level. And then capitalism would take over and people could buy and sell, but there would be a reset. Well, my students often say, but that worked under a theocracy. It couldn't work in our time. But Ellen White says, if nations followed these principles today, there would be a diminishment of social strife, and there would be much more harmony in our cities and in our country. And there are Christians that have taken these biblical principles seriously and have worked to bring a year of Jubilee to many developing nations. Now, some of you may remember this from the year 2000. That was the year they focused on. Let's make Jubilee 2000 a year to forgive the debts of many developing nations. It was an explicitly religious movement by Christians taking the principles of the yearly Sabbaths from the Old Testament and applying them to our world today. And they were tremendously successful. They had $100 billion worth of debt forgiven to third world nations. And they continue this work even now. As recently as 2015, this group was instrumental in helping Puerto Rico have its debt restructured to allow for more money to go to education and health care. Now, are there Adventists involved in this? Not that I can find, but why not? Isn't the Sabbath our message? How have we overlooked the importance of the Sabbath teachings, right? Even in the weekly Sabbath, there's this concept of equality. Who gets to rest on the Sabbath? The father is king of the family? Well, maybe the mother and the father is the king and the queen, but the children are supposed to serve them, right? No, the mother and the father and the children and even the servants and even the stranger, the immigrant, right, from the outside, and even the animals. Is there an ecological, environmental aspect to the Sabbath? There is, if you look at it, and then the yearly Sabbath take those elements and expand them out into society and allows for a rest of the land itself. And these we as Adventists have managed to turn the Sabbath somehow into this thing about as long as we can worship and sit around on the correct day of the week, we're keeping the Sabbath. Well, there's so much more to it, right? And there's so much more to it prophetically and socially that we have not grasped. Now, in Puerto Rico today, the Adventist Church, I'm having trouble with this. Maybe my battery. Can you forward the slide? Yeah. What if our Sabbath message, the Adventist Church is not growing, it hasn't grown in Puerto Rico for 40 years. We preach the Sabbath, we have evangelistic campaigns, people don't care. We're talking about a day that maybe at some point in the future will be a test. Well, it's not a test. There's not Sunday laws. People are like, why is this relevant? What if we were able to preach the Sabbath, including those things, but also going beyond it to an understanding of the Sabbath that actually deals with the problems and challenges that people are facing today in their lives and in their society? It wouldn't be to turn the Adventist gospel into just a social gospel. It would be to take the Adventist gospel and message of prophecy and show its social dimensions and what it should mean in our lives. Right? This isn't just happening in Puerto Rico. The Adventist Church is not growing in the United States. It's not growing in Florida. It is only growing from the outside as immigrants come in. The millennials are leaving the church because the millennials don't live in a predicted future. They live now. And they want to know what your church is doing to face the problems and challenges and inequalities in the world now. And if they see you doing that, maybe they'll be interested in what you have to say about the future and something that happened in the past. But there's got to be a reframing of our prophetic message so that it doesn't become lost in being purely spiritual. Our pioneers saw our prophetic message speaking to the social problems and divisions of the day in ways that caused them to take profound action in their communities. And I want to close with this thought that, some say we need to preach the gospel and leave aside these things that divide our society and our communities, these issues of race and justice and unfairness. But I want to suggest to you that the early church faced exactly these same kinds of problems, and that their way of dealing it perhaps should be a model and a guide for us today. You're all familiar with the story, and you don't particularly think of it as a social justice story, but it's about the deacons being served, being chosen in Acts chapter 6. What was the problem they were trying to solve? It was the first ethnic conflict in the church. The Greek widows, it was claimed, were being ignored and overlooked for the Hebrew widows. Now, who was overseeing this? The apostles, right? And the apostles, what ethnicity were they? They were all Hebrews. And so the thought was the apostles are leading out and they're unfairly advantaging the Hebrew widows and leaving the Greek widows out in the cold. Now, do you think that they were really doing that? I guess we don't know for sure, but I don't think they were meaning to do that, and I don't think they were intentionally doing that, but rather than getting all defensive about it, they said, this is a perception, and we need to deal with this, and we're going to appoint some people to help. And they appointed the 7 deacons, and if you go through that list of names, do you know where all the deacons are from? Those are a list of 7 Greek names. So the deacons represent a representation of this community now in leadership. So if you think about that story, it's the first example of affirmative action in the West, and it took place in the Christian church. So the leadership didn't become all defensive about it. The leadership said, no, we need for there to be fairness in the church of God. Now, the thing that really struck me about this story recently is after it's told, you come to verse 7. And verse 7 tells you what happens next. And what happens next is that the word of God spread, and the number of the disciples multiplied greatly in Jerusalem, and a great many of the priests were obedient to the faith. Now, had Pentecost already happened? It had. The gospel had started spreading, and there had been an initial surge, but perhaps things had kind of died down, like Adventism, like we had this explosion, the great disappointment, the preaching, we're all the nations of the world practically, and yet we've kind of slowed down. We're kind of long past our early days of Pentecost. And they dealt with this issue of inequity internally in the church. And it was then that outsiders noticed there was something different here. And there was an even greater explosion of the gospel. And the priests represent the educated classes, right? The elites in society. And they knew that if a group could overcome these cultural divides and show the love of God internally, that there must be something supernatural happening here. This was the witness that brought the gospel broader attention. So maybe we need to reframe our thinking a little bit. Maybe when we say we've got to leave these social justice issues aside and preach the gospel, maybe it's in fact the gospel's task to help us deal with these social divisions in our church so people can see the power of the gospel and our preaching can actually have the effect that it's intended to have. Right? Is that a rather revolutionary thought? Is that something the story from the early church might tell us? So ironically, the key to Adventist gospel may not be doing in many more Revelation seminars, but it may be bringing the gospel message to bear on the social racial inequities and injustices in our own midst, then the world may care what we preach and teach. It's Christ who said, "They shall know that you are my disciples when you have love one for another." This is the ultimate test or witness of the divine presence in our midst. And I pray that the Lord and the Holy Spirit will be with your church as you seek to become more unified and an even brighter community, witness to the neighbors that surround you.